The thing I was wondering is, because I know I obviously know them quite well, Peter and obviously Harry, and I was kind of thinking that I can almost imagine that there would have certainly been some kind of phone call, even though he may not have been invited. I still think that there would have been a discussion about it because they're close, and maybe Harry was probably aware that it wasn't a good idea to be, because the thing is, it will overshadow. That's right, to overshadow the wedding, and obviously they don't want to do that. I would think they wouldn't want to do. I'd hope they wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing, isn't it? I would wonder whether he'd actually been invited at all for that reason.
Imagine attending your own wedding and discovering that some of the loudest conversations surrounding the event are about two people who aren't even there. That is exactly the bizarre situation we have witnessed this week. Peter Phillips and Harriet Sperling's wedding should have been the story. It should have been a day focused on the couple, their family, their guests, and the celebration itself. Instead, large sections of the British media once again found themselves circling back to the same topic they claimed to be exhausted by: Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex. The irony is almost too perfect. For years, we have been told that Harry and Meghan are irrelevant. We have been told that nobody cares. We've been told that the public has moved on. We have been told that the Sussexes are yesterday's news. Yet here we are. A royal wedding takes place thousands of miles from Montecito, California, and somehow Harry and Meghan still become one of the biggest talking points. You could not write a better comedy script if you tried. The moment reports surfaced that the Sussexes would not be attending, the discussion machine switched into overdrive. Commentators debated it, newspapers analyzed it, television panels dissected it, social media accounts speculated about it. People were discussing two individuals who were not even physically present. And then came one of the most revealing moments of all. During that discussion on GB News, former royal butler Gerald Harold made a comment that unintentionally exposed the contradiction at the center of years of anti-Sussex commentary. He suggested that Harry may have understood that attending the wedding could overshadow the event itself. Think carefully about what that means. Not that Harry planned to make a speech, not that Meghan intended to create drama, not that the Sussexes would announce a new project. Simply showing up would be enough to dominate headlines. That is a remarkable admission, because if Harry and Meghan are supposedly irrelevant, how exactly can they overshadow a royal wedding by merely attending? The math is not mathing, the logic is refusing to cooperate, and the narrative is collapsing under its own weight. You cannot simultaneously argue that nobody cares about Harry and Meghan while also worrying that their presence would become the biggest story of the day. Those two ideas cannot comfortably live in the same universe. And this is where things become truly fascinating. The very people who spend years insisting the Sussexes have no influence are often the first people discussing them whenever any royal event occurs. Birthday celebration? What about Harry and Meghan? Trooping the color? What about Harry and Meghan? Wedding? What about Harry and Meghan? Garden party? What about Harry and Meghan? At this point, some sections of the media appear less interested in covering royal events than they are in finding ways to connect every royal event back to Harry and Meghan. The obsession has become the story. Now, let's consider the alternative. Imagine Harry and Meghan had attended. Would headlines have focused solely on Peter Phillips and Harriet Sperling? Let's be honest. Within minutes, newspapers would be running stories asking whether Harry spoke to William. Body language experts would emerge from their natural habitat and begin analyzing every glance, smile, blink, and handshake. Lip readers would suddenly become the busiest people in Britain. Entire articles would be written about Meghan's outfit. Every photograph would be scrutinized. Every interaction would be dissected. Every facial expression would become a national emergency. The wedding itself could easily have become secondary to Harry and Meghan narrative. That isn't necessarily Harry and Meghan's fault. It is a reflection of the extraordinary level of attention they continue to generate. In fact, the media reaction to their absence may have proven the point better than their presence ever could, because despite not attending, they still became part of the conversation. think about how extraordinary that is. The couple stayed in California. They did not arrive. They did not walk into the venue. They did not pose for photographs. They did not give interviews. They did not release statements. And yet major discussions still revolved around them.
That is influence. That is visibility. That is cultural relevance, whether people like it or not. Meanwhile, there was another element to the story that social media users could not stop joking about: the weather. British weather once again decided to remind everyone that it operates according to its own mysterious rules. Reports and photographs showed heavy rain affecting the celebrations. Even King Charles and Queen Camilla were reported to have left earlier than expected as conditions deteriorated. Now, nobody can control the weather. Not the bride, not the groom, not the guests, not even the royal family. Rain happens. But social media quickly had fun with the contrast. While people in California were enjoying sunshine, discussions in Britain revolved around umbrellas, raincoats, muddy conditions, and soggy photographs. The jokes practically wrote themselves. Of course, the weather is not the important part of the story. The important part is the contrast between expectation and reality. The expectation was that Harry and Meghan's absence would remove them from the headlines. The reality was exactly the opposite. Their absence became a headline, and that tells us something significant about where public attention still gravitates. Whether supporters love them or critics dislike them, Harry and Meghan remain figures who attract conversation on a scale few public personalities can match. That is not an opinion. It is observable reality. The evidence appears every single time an event occurs. Every birthday, every appearance, every project, every photograph, every rumor, every royal gathering. The cycle repeats itself. And perhaps that is why the GB News discussion felt so revealing. For a brief moment, the conversation accidentally acknowledged what many people have been observing for years. Harry and Meghan do not need to attend an event to become part of the story. The media does that for them. The commentators do that for them. The endless speculation does that for them. The headlines do that for them. The critics do that for them. The wedding coverage itself demonstrated the point. If your absence generates almost as much discussion as your presence would have generated, then your influence remains very real. That may not be what some commentators want to admit, but it is increasingly difficult to deny. In the end, Peter Phillips and Harriet Sperling deserved their special day and hopefully enjoyed it despite the weather. But the media reaction surrounding Harry and Meghan offered a fascinating reminder of something we have seen repeatedly. The Sussexes continue to occupy a unique position in the royal conversation. They can attend and become the story. They can stay home and become the story. They can remain silent and become the story. And when even their absence dominates discussion, perhaps the biggest headline is not that they weren't there. Perhaps the biggest headline is that people still cannot stop talking about them. Now, let's talk about the part nobody seems willing to say out loud. If Harry and Meghan had attended this wedding, there's a very good chance the media would have spent the next week producing thousands upon thousands of words, analyzing their every move. Not Peter's every move, not Harriet's every move, Harry and Meghan's every move. That is simply the pattern we have watched for years. The Sussexes could walk into a room, sit quietly, enjoy a meal, congratulate the bride and groom, and leave. And somehow that would still generate 47 opinion pieces, 12 television debates, 3 body language analyses, 2 lip reading specials, and 1 emergency panel discussion about the future of the monarchy. Human beings are remarkable creatures. Someone can attend a wedding and somehow become responsible for a constitutional crisis before dessert is served. And this is why Gerald Harold's comments were so interesting, because whether people agree with him or not, he effectively acknowledged a reality that many royal commentators spend enormous amounts of time trying not to acknowledge. Attention follows Harry and Meghan, not occasionally, not sometimes, consistently. The moment their names enter a conversation, the level of interest changes, the engagement changes, the headlines change, the social media traffic changes, the audience numbers change. That is why television networks keep discussing them. That is why newspapers keep writing about them. That is why commentators keep mentioning them. Because despite all the claims that nobody cares, the numbers tell a very different story. If nobody cared, there would be no discussion. If nobody cared, there would be no headlines. If nobody cared, there would be no endless panels debating every tiny detail of their lives. Media companies do not repeatedly cover stories that attract no attention. They cover stories that people click on. Stories that people watch. Stories that people share. Stories that generate engagement. And Harry and Meghan continued to do exactly that. The funniest part is that some critics seem trapped in a cycle entirely of their own making. They complain about Harry and Meghan receiving attention, then they spend hours discussing Harry and Meghan, then they create headlines about Harry and Meghan, then they create television segments about Harry and Meghan, then they complain again about Harry and Meghan receiving attention. At some point, it begins to resemble a dog chasing its own tail. Round and round and round it goes. Nobody seems quite sure how it started. Nobody seems quite sure how it ends, yet somehow it continues. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan were reportedly living their lives thousands of miles away. No red carpet, no speech, no interview, no public appearance. Nothing. And yet, they still became one of the most discussed aspects of the event. That is what makes this story so fascinating. Not because they attended, not because they made headlines through an action, but because they made headlines through an absence. Think about how unusual that is. Most public figures disappear from the conversation when they are not present. Harry and Meghan often generate conversation simply by not showing up. That level of attention is rare, very rare. And perhaps that explains why discussions about them continue to dominate media coverage years after they stepped away from royal duties. Whether people support them or criticize them, they remain central figures in the broader royal narrative. The media may not always like that fact, certain commentators may not always like that fact, but reality does not particularly care about personal preferences. Reality simply keeps showing the same result, again and again and again. The wedding happened, the Sussexes stayed home, and somehow the Sussexes still became one of the stories. That alone says more than 1,000 opinion columns ever could. Because at the end of the day, influence is not measured by how loudly people praise you. Influence is measured by attention. Influence is measured by relevance. Influence is measured by whether people continue talking about you even when you are not there. By that standard, this entire conversation may have accidentally revealed far more than it intended. And that may be the biggest takeaway from all of this. The Sussexes did not need to win a headline battle. The headline battle came looking for them. They did not need to attend, they did not need to pose, they did not need to explain, they did not need to respond. The discussion happened anyway. And perhaps that is why this entire situation feels so ironic. The effort to explain their absence ended up highlighting their significance. The effort to move the focus elsewhere ended up bringing the focus right back. The effort to discuss a wedding ended up producing another national conversation about Harry and Meghan. For supporters, that observation will feel familiar. For critics, it may feel frustrating. For neutral observers, it is simply fascinating. But whichever side of the debate people happen to occupy, one thing seems impossible to ignore. The Sussexes remain one of the most talked about couples in the world, and based on this week's events, that reality does not appear to be changing anytime soon. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Have a blessed weekend.